The moment people stop seeing your worth is the moment they reveal who they really are. I remember staring at the roast chicken in the center of the table when my daughter-in-law decided to humiliate me in front of everyone. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled Daniel's dining room, warm and inviting. The kind of smell that usually reminded me of holidays and family and the little moments I spent my whole life trying to protect. But that night, every laugh sounded sharper than usual. Every glance felt colder. Jessica sat across from me in her cream-colored sweater, holding a wine glass between perfectly manicured fingers, smiling the way people smile when they already know everyone in the room is on their side. My son Daniel was beside her, scrolling through something on his phone while pretending to listen to the conversation. The football game played softly in the living room. Their golden retriever wandered near the kitchen island hoping someone would drop scraps. It looked like a normal Sunday dinner. That was the dangerous part. Humiliation rarely announces itself before it arrives. "So, Margaret," Jessica said suddenly, loud enough for everyone at the table to stop eating. "Daniel told me the library officially let you go this week." I felt my fork pause in my hand. Across from me, Daniel avoided my eyes immediately. That hurt more than her words. I swallowed slowly and nodded once. "Yes," I said calmly. "Budget cuts." Jessica tilted her head with fake sympathy. "That's the second job in what, 3 years?" She let out a small laugh before taking a sip of wine. "I just can't imagine being unemployed at your age." Nobody spoke. Her friend Melissa looked down at her plate. Daniel scratched his jaw nervously but stayed silent. Jessica leaned back in her chair and smiled wider. "Honestly, how does it feel to be a loser this late in life?" The room became so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed in the neighborhood. My grandson Ethan stopped chewing his mashed potatoes and looked at me with confused eyes. I should have cried. That's probably what Jessica expected. Maybe she expected me to defend myself. Maybe she wanted another story to tell her friends later over cocktails and charcuterie boards. But instead, I smiled. Just a small smile. Calm. Controlled. The kind of smile that makes people uncomfortable because they can't tell what's behind it. Jessica's expression flickered for half a second. She wasn't expecting that. "Well," I said softly while setting my napkin on my lap. "Life has a funny way of surprising people." Daniel finally looked at me then, relieved I wasn't causing a scene. My son always hated conflict. Even as a little boy, he used to hide upstairs when his father and I argued about bills. I protected that gentle heart his entire life. After my husband died of a heart attack 21 years ago, I worked every job I could find just to keep Daniel's world stable. I cleaned motel rooms during the day. I stocked grocery shelves at night. There were winters when I kept the thermostat at 62 degrees just so I could afford his school field trips. I sold my wedding ring to help pay his college tuition and told him I'd misplaced it because I never wanted him carrying guilt on his shoulders. But sacrifices become invisible once people get comfortable. Jessica didn't know any of that. Or maybe she did and simply didn't care. To her, I was just an aging woman with thinning silver hair, sensible shoes, and another failed job. A burden standing between her and the polished life she wanted. She reached for the breadbasket and chuckled again. I mean, seriously, retirement age and still getting fired? That's gotta be embarrassing. Melissa gave a nervous laugh this time, the kind people use when they're afraid not to join in. Daniel finally spoke, but not to defend me. "Jess," he muttered quietly, "let's just eat. Not stop. Not apologize. Just eat." I looked around the table and realized something painful in that moment. People don't always betray you loudly. Sometimes they betray you with silence. I picked up my water glass carefully, my hand perfectly steady. "You know," I said gently, "when people underestimate you, they usually reveal more about themselves than they do about you." Jessica smirked. "That sounds like something people say when they're broke." The table laughed softly again. And that was the exact moment I stopped protecting them in my heart. Not angrily, not dramatically, just quietly, like a door locking for the final time. Because while Jessica sat there mocking me for losing my job, she had absolutely no idea who she was really talking to. And she definitely had no idea what was already set in motion. I stayed another 20 minutes after Jessica's little performance at the dinner table because women my age learn something important very early in life. Leaving too quickly lets cruel people believe they hurt you. So I sat there calmly while she passed around homemade cheesecake and pretended nothing had happened. Daniel finally turned off the football game, and started collecting empty plates, while Jessica laughed loudly with her friend Melissa near the kitchen island. Every now and then she glanced toward me with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she had established her place in the family hierarchy. Younger, smarter, more successful, more important. It amazed me how comfortable she had become humiliating me in my own son's house. What hurt most was not even the insult itself. It was how ordinary it had become. 3 years earlier, Jessica used to call me every Sunday asking for my apple pie recipe or advice about decorating their first apartment. She hugged me tightly at family barbecues and told people how lucky she was to have me as a mother-in-law. But something changed after Daniel got promoted at his accounting firm. More money came in. Bigger vacations started appearing on social media. Designer handbags replaced practical purchases. Somewhere along the way, kindness became optional to her. Respect became conditional. And older people without visible success slowly became invisible. Or worse, embarrassing. I grabbed my coat from the hallway chair and heard Jessica's voice drift from the kitchen. I just do not understand how someone keeps losing jobs at that age. She whispered loudly enough for me to hear. Melissa laughed softly. Maybe she just cannot keep up anymore. Jessica lowered her voice again, but not enough. Daniel feels guilty about her. That is the only reason she is still around so much. Still around. Like I was an unwanted decoration nobody had thrown out yet. I slipped my arms into my coat carefully and looked at the framed family photos lining the hallway wall. Disney World. Thanksgiving in Vermont. Ethan's kindergarten graduation. I noticed something strange then. In newer photos, I was always positioned near the edge, sometimes half cut off entirely. It was subtle, but once I saw it, I could not unsee it. Erasing someone rarely happens all at once. Usually it happens inch by inch. Daniel walked me to the front door with his usual nervous energy. "Mom, Jessica had wine," he said quietly while avoiding eye contact. "You know how she gets." I stared at him for a long moment. My beautiful boy with tired eyes and expensive sneakers and shoulders permanently bent from trying to please everyone except himself. "Daniel," I asked softly, "do you think I am a loser?" His face immediately tightened with discomfort. "Of course not." But he answered too quickly, like a man trying to put out a fire before smoke appeared. "Then why did you let your wife speak to me that way?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Excuses floated through his mind, searching for somewhere to land. Stress, wine, misunderstanding, personality differences. People always become very creative when protecting the wrong person. Finally, he sighed. "She did not mean it like that." I almost smiled again. That sentence. I had heard versions of it my entire life. Your husband did not mean it like that. Your boss did not mean it like that. Your family did not mean it like that. Somehow cruel people were always given endless translations, while decent people were expected to quietly absorb the damage. I reached over and fixed the crooked collar on Daniel's sweater the same way I used to when he was a little boy heading off to school. "One day," I said gently, "you are going to realize silence costs more than honesty." Cold November air rushed against my face as I stepped outside. The porch light flickered softly above me while dry leaves scraped across the driveway. Behind the curtains, I could still see Jessica laughing in the kitchen, holding her wine glass like she had won something important. And maybe she thought she had. What she did not know was that earlier that same afternoon, before dinner even began, I had spent 2 hours downtown in a quiet office reviewing documents that would change every relationship in that family forever. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise like I always did. Some habits stay with you no matter how much life changes. I brewed coffee in the small blue ceramic pot my husband bought during our 20th anniversary trip to Maine and stood quietly beside the kitchen window, watching rain slide down the glass. My apartment was modest. 1 bedroom, faded cream walls, a tiny balcony overlooking a grocery store parking lot. Jessica once called it depressing after helping me move in 2 years earlier. She had walked through the place wearing 4-inch heels and expensive perfume, looking around like she was touring a storage unit instead of someone's home. "Well," she said back then while forcing a smile, "at least it is temporary." But it was not temporary. It was peaceful. And peace becomes valuable when you spend enough years surviving chaos. My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter around 8:30 that morning. "Daniel." I let it ring twice before answering. "Morning, Mom," he said carefully. His voice carried that familiar nervous tone again. Jessica feels bad about last night. I almost laughed into my coffee. Not because it was funny, but because people like Jessica never actually felt bad about cruelty. They only felt uncomfortable when consequences started becoming possible. Does she? I asked calmly. She was drinking, he continued quickly. And things have been stressful lately. There it was again. Another excuse carefully gift-wrapped for someone who never offered the same grace to others. I stared at the rain outside my window. Daniel, I said softly, when your father was dying in that hospital room, do you know what scared him most? Silence filled the line. He was afraid you would grow into a man who let people lose their dignity just to keep the peace. Daniel exhaled heavily. Mom. No, I interrupted gently. I am not angry. I am simply tired. Those words seemed to hit him harder than yelling ever could. Because disappointment spoken quietly carries weight. He changed the subject after that, asking whether I needed groceries or help with rent, the same way he always did after Jessica crossed the line. Financial guilt was easier for him than emotional accountability. I am fine, I told him. Actually better than fine. And for the first time in years, I meant it. After we hung up, I opened the brown leather folder sitting on my kitchen table. Inside were copies of financial statements, property documents, and a business valuation report stamped with yesterday's date. 21 years ago, shortly before my husband passed away, he invested in a small commercial real estate partnership with two close friends. Nobody expected much from it back then. Certainly not enough to matter decades later. But over time, downtown expansion transformed those old properties into something extremely valuable. My husband left his entire share to me. Quietly. Privately. Even Daniel never knew the full extent of it because I never wanted money shaping how my son treated me. I wanted love to be enough. That was my mistake. My lawyer Richard called around noon. Margaret, he said warmly. The final numbers came in this morning. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. And, after taxes and distributions, your share comes to a little over $4.8 million. The rain outside had finally stopped. Sunlight pushed softly through the clouds and spilled across my countertop. $4.8 million. Funny how people decide your value based on whether they can see your paycheck. Jessica spent years looking down on me while sitting only a few feet away from the woman quietly holding more financial security than anyone else in that family combined. Richard cleared his throat gently. You also mentioned updating your estate planning documents. I looked down at the framed photo near my coffee mug. Daniel at age 8, missing his front tooth, grinning beside the bicycle I worked 3 extra weekends to afford. I loved my son deeply. That had never changed. But love without respect eventually turns into permission for mistreatment. Yes, I said quietly. I think it is finally time. 3 days passed before I saw Jessica again, and somehow she managed to become even more arrogant in less than a week. Daniel invited me to Ethan's school fundraiser on Thursday evening, a polished little event held inside the elementary school gymnasium with folding chairs, silent auction tables, and homemade brownies wrapped in plastic. Parents walked around carrying paper cups of coffee, while children ran between tables showing off artwork taped to the walls. It should have felt wholesome. Instead, the moment I walked in, I noticed Jessica scanning me from head to toe with that familiar look of judgment she had perfected over the years. I wore a navy blue wool coat and low heels, simple but elegant. My husband used to tell me Grace did not need attention to be noticed. Jessica believed the opposite. She approached me near the raffle table with an artificial smile already prepared. Margaret, she said loudly, air kissing beside my cheek without touching me. I was not sure you would come since, you know, gas prices are still pretty high. 2 nearby mothers chuckled awkwardly. I smiled politely. Thankfully, I managed the drive. She tilted her head. That is good. We would hate for you to become isolated. There was always poison hidden inside her sweetness. Tiny little cuts designed to embarrass without looking openly cruel. That was Jessica's real talent. Not intelligence. Not kindness. Performance. Daniel walked over carrying 2 hot chocolates for Ethan and completely missed the tension standing right in front of him. Mom, he said, Jessica and I have been looking at houses lately. Of course they had. Jessica immediately brightened. Oh my gosh, yes. We found this beautiful place about 20 minutes outside the city. 5 bedrooms, huge kitchen, vaulted ceilings, everything. She pulled out her phone before I could answer and started swiping through photos. Marble countertops, floor-to-ceiling windows. A backyard large enough to host weddings. The asking price is almost 1.8 million, she said proudly. But honestly, houses in that area are only going to get more expensive. I looked at the screen quietly. It was beautiful. Cold, but beautiful. The kind of home people buy to impress guests instead of building memories. That sounds ambitious, I said carefully. Jessica laughed. Well, successful people have to think long-term. There it was again. That word. Successful. She used it constantly, usually right before insulting someone indirectly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. We are still figuring things out financially, he admitted. Interest rates are rough right now. Jessica waved her hand dismissively. We will make it work. Then she looked directly at me with a strange little smile. Family helps family, right? The sentence hung in the air longer than she intended. Suddenly, everything became clearer. The fake apologies. Daniel calling me more often this week. Jessica trying slightly harder to appear polite in public. They wanted something. Not reconciliation. Not closeness. Money. I almost admired the timing. She humiliated me while secretly expecting me to finance the lifestyle she dreamed about. Ethan came running over then, holding a crayon drawing of a lighthouse beside the ocean. Grandma Margaret, look what I made. His smile was pure in a way adults no longer knew how to be. I bent down carefully and admired every detail like it belonged in a museum. This is beautiful, I told him honestly. Jessica glanced at the paper and laughed softly. He gets emotional over little things just like your side of the family. Ethan's smile faded slightly. Something inside me hardened then. Not rage. Not revenge. Clarity. There is a moment when love stops blinding you and starts teaching you instead. I stood back up slowly and looked around the crowded gymnasium filled with parents pretending happiness guaranteed kindness. Then I looked directly at Jessica. You know, I said calmly, money reveals character faster than poverty ever does. Her smile twitched for just a second before returning. That sounds deep, she replied lightly. But I noticed something important then. For the first time since this all began, Jessica looked uncertain. By the following Sunday, Jessica had transformed completely. Not kinder, just strategic. She greeted me at the front door with exaggerated warmth and offered to hang my coat herself. Daniel looked relieved the moment he saw us acting civil. Men like my son often confuse temporary politeness with genuine change because it allows them to avoid difficult truths. The dining room smelled like garlic bread and tomato sauce, and soft jazz music drifted through the house, while candles flickered in the center of the table. Everything looked carefully arranged, almost theatrical. Jessica even used the expensive plates she normally saved for holidays. Margaret, you look lovely tonight, she said while pouring sparkling water into my glass. Compliments from her always sounded rehearsed, like lines memorized before a performance review. I smiled politely and thanked her anyway. Ethan ran into the room wearing dinosaur pajamas and wrapped his little arms around my waist. Mom says we might get a house with a swimming pool, he announced proudly. Jessica laughed from the kitchen. Not just a pool. Wait until Grandma sees the movie theater room. Daniel chuckled nervously and looked toward me for approval. It amazed me how quickly grown adults become children again when money enters the conversation. Dinner began smoothly enough. Jessica talked about luxury neighborhoods 30 minutes outside the city where the right kind of families lived. She described private schools, golf memberships, and custom kitchens with the excitement of someone narrating a fairy tale. Then came the real reason for the invitation. It arrived slowly, hidden beneath layers of fake casualness. We met with the mortgage advisor yesterday, Daniel said carefully while twirling pasta around his fork. Everything looks good except the down payment. Jessica immediately jumped in. It is just frustrating because we are so close. I dabbed my napkin gently against my lips. I see. She leaned forward slightly. The thing is, this house would really change Ethan's future. There it was. The emotional angle. Not luxury. Not status. Family. Children. Opportunity. People become very creative when asking for money without technically asking for money. Daniel cleared his throat. We were thinking maybe there are ways the family could help each other temporarily. I noticed he still could not say the words directly. Jessica could. Honestly, Margaret, even a small contribution from you would mean a lot. Small contribution. I almost admired the phrasing considering she believed I was unemployed, struggling, and barely surviving. What exactly did she think I could contribute? Grocery coupons? Old furniture? How much are you short? I asked calmly. Jessica answered before Daniel could speak. About 150,000. The number landed on the table like a challenge. Ethan looked up from his macaroni, completely unaware that adults were negotiating dignity around him. I took a slow sip of water and watched Jessica carefully. She truly believed she deserved this life. Not earned. Deserved. And somehow, despite every insult she had thrown at me, she expected access to anything I might have left to give. That is a substantial amount, I said softly. Jessica forced a little laugh. Well, these days success costs money. Then she glanced toward Daniel before adding, some people understand how investments work better than others. There it was again. Another insult carefully dressed as conversation. Daniel stared at his plate. Silent. Predictable. Weak. Something peaceful settled inside me then. Not sadness anymore. Certainty. I reached into my purse slowly and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Jessica's eyes immediately lit up with anticipation, probably imagining a check. Instead, I slid the paper across the table toward Daniel. What is this? He asked. An address, I replied calmly. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I want both of you to meet me there. Jessica frowned slightly while unfolding the paper. Her expression shifted from excitement to confusion. A law office? She asked. I smiled gently. Yes. The room went quiet again. Outside, snow had just begun falling softly against the windows. Jessica looked at Daniel uncertainly for the first time since I had known her. And deep down, I think she finally realized something important. I was no longer playing the role she had assigned to me. Monday morning arrived. Gray and bitterly cold. Downtown traffic crawled through slushy streets while Christmas decorations hung from lampposts outside office buildings. I arrived at Richard's law office 15 minutes early wearing a charcoal coat and pearl earrings my husband once bought me during a difficult year when we could barely afford groceries. He used to say elegant women carried themselves with dignity long before they carried wealth. Jessica and Daniel arrived together exactly at 10 o'clock. Jessica stepped into the lobby wearing a white designer coat and tall leather boots. Looking around immediately with curiosity, she tried to hide. The polished marble floors, framed artwork, and quiet receptionist clearly impressed her. Suddenly, I did not look quite so pathetic anymore. Margaret, she said carefully, what exactly is this about? I smiled calmly. You will see soon enough. Daniel looked exhausted already. He loosened his tie while glancing nervously between me and the receptionist leading us toward the conference room. Richard stood when we entered, greeting me warmly before shaking Daniel's hand. Jessica noticed that immediately too. Respect leaves traces. Please, Richard said, gesturing toward the chairs. Have a seat. Jessica sat perfectly straight with her purse folded neatly in her lap, trying to appear composed, but I could see anticipation building behind her eyes. She thought this meeting was about financial help. Maybe a trust fund. Maybe an inheritance discussion. Maybe I was finally ready to reward her performance. Richard opened a thick folder slowly. Margaret recently finalized several major financial transactions. He began professionally. Daniel frowned. Financial transactions? Richard nodded. As of last week, the commercial property holdings left to Margaret by her late husband were sold through a structured agreement totaling approximately $4.8 million after taxes. Silence. Complete silence. Jessica blinked once, then twice. Daniel stared at me like he had forgotten how to breathe. For point, he whispered. Jessica's entire posture changed instantly. It was almost frightening how quickly contempt transforms into admiration when money enters the room. Margaret, she said softly, almost laughing in disbelief. Why did you never tell us? I folded my hands calmly on the table. Nobody asked with kindness. Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly. Mom, you are serious? Very. Richard slid several documents across the polished table. Margaret also updated her estate planning this week. Jessica immediately reached toward the papers before stopping herself, trying not to appear too eager. But hunger has a way of showing itself anyway. Richard continued speaking in that steady attorney voice people use when delivering life-changing information. Margaret has established an educational trust for Ethan that will fully cover private schooling, college tuition, and future academic expenses. Daniel's eyes filled instantly. Mom, I nodded gently. He deserves stability. Jessica swallowed hard. And the rest? she asked before she could stop herself. There it was. Not gratitude. Not emotion. The rest. Richard adjusted his glasses carefully. The remainder of Margaret's estate has been allocated according to revised instructions finalized Friday afternoon. Jessica smiled nervously now. Well, obviously Daniel would manage things eventually anyway. Richard looked down at the document. Actually, no. The room became still again. Outside the tall conference room windows, snow drifted softly between downtown buildings. Daniel stared at Richard with confusion, while Jessica's expression slowly tightened. Margaret has designated the majority of her remaining assets toward charitable foundations, educational programs, and a private living trust controlled solely by her. Jessica turned toward me sharply. What does that mean? I met her eyes calmly. It means my money will finally go where respect exists. Daniel looked devastated. Mom, you think we only care about your money? I held his gaze gently. No, Daniel. I think money simply exposed what was already there. Jessica's cheeks flushed red. That is not fair. I almost smiled. Fair. I repeated softly. Jessica, you mocked me for being unemployed before asking me for $150,000. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, because some truths are too clean to argue against. Richard quietly excused himself from the room a moment later, leaving the three of us alone in the silence we had all earned. Jessica recovered faster than I expected. That was the thing about people who spent their lives chasing status. Embarrassment rarely changed them for long. By Friday evening, she was already pretending the meeting at Richard's office had simply been a misunderstanding instead of a complete collapse of the story she built about me in her mind. Daniel called twice during the week asking if we could move forward positively as a family. He always spoke like a man trying to smooth wrinkles out of fabric instead of confronting the reason they appeared. I agreed to dinner anyway, not because I owed them comfort, but because clarity deserves witnesses. Snow covered the sidewalks outside their neighborhood by the time I arrived. Christmas lights glowed softly across rooftops while smoke drifted from chimneys into the freezing air. Inside the house, Jessica had transformed herself into the perfect hostess again. Candles burned. Soft music played. A roast sat beautifully arranged on the kitchen counter beside expensive wine glasses. She even hugged me at the door. Margaret, I have been thinking about you all week, she said sweetly. I realized maybe we got off on the wrong foot lately. Maybe. Such a small word for such large cruelty. During dinner, she complimented my sweater twice and asked thoughtful questions about my health, my hobbies, even books I enjoyed reading. Daniel looked visibly relieved watching us interact peacefully. He kept smiling like a child whose parents finally stopped arguing during the holidays. But false kindness has a rhythm to it. Too careful, too polished, too sudden. And eventually the truth always pushes through. Halfway through dessert, Jessica casually mentioned the house again. The sellers are actually lowering the price slightly, she said while stirring whipped cream into her coffee. It feels like fate. Daniel glanced toward me cautiously. We are still figuring things out. Jessica smiled softly. Honestly, after learning about your financial situation, Margaret, I think we all realized this could become a wonderful opportunity for the whole family. There it was. Opportunity. Such a pretty word for entitlement. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. Jessica, I asked gently, do you remember what you said to me at dinner last Sunday? Her expression froze for the briefest moment. I think emotions were high, she answered quickly. No, I replied calmly. You were very clear. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mom, but I continued quietly. You asked me how it felt to be a loser. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Jessica forced a nervous smile. I apologized. No, I said gently. You adjusted. That landed exactly where it needed to. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not with anger yet. With exposure. I leaned back in my chair calmly. You treated me with contempt when you believed I had nothing. Then the moment you discovered I had money, suddenly I became valuable again. Jessica laughed softly, but there was tension underneath it now. That is not fair. Fair. I repeated quietly. Jessica, you measured my worth by employment status while secretly hoping I would finance your dream house. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. Please, can we not do this tonight? I looked at my son for a long moment. That is exactly the problem, Daniel. Nobody ever wants to do this. Nobody wants uncomfortable honesty. That is why disrespect grows so easily in families. Jessica set her coffee cup down harder than intended. I think you are being dramatic. I almost smiled. No, I think I am finally being honest. Ethan wandered into the dining room, then carrying a blanket, sleepy from watching cartoons upstairs. He climbed into my lap without hesitation and rested his head against my shoulder. Children always know where safety lives. Jessica watched us silently while something cold settled across her face. Maybe jealousy, maybe resentment, maybe the realization that money could buy houses, but not loyalty. I kissed Ethan gently on the forehead before looking back at her. You know what surprised me most? I said softly. It was never the insult itself. It was how comfortable you felt saying it out loud. And for the first time since I had known her, Jessica had absolutely nothing to say back. After that dinner, something shifted permanently inside the house Daniel and Jessica built together. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quiet shifts are always the ones that matter most. Jessica stopped making direct jokes about my age or employment, but the warmth she performed so carefully had cracks in it now. I could see resentment underneath every polite smile. She hated that I had changed the balance of power without raising my voice once. Daniel started calling me more often after that night, sometimes twice a day. He asked if I needed help with errands, groceries, doctor appointments. At first glance it sounded caring, but mothers know the difference between love and guilt. One Tuesday afternoon, he came by my apartment carrying expensive pastries from a bakery downtown Jessica used to brag about on social media. Thought we could have coffee together, he said awkwardly. I invited him in anyway. Snow fell softly outside while we sat at my tiny kitchen table beneath the yellow glow of an old hanging lamp. Daniel looked around the apartment differently now. Before, he barely noticed it. Suddenly, he complimented the framed paintings on my walls and the little herb garden near the window. Money had not changed my apartment. It changed his eyesight. Mom, he said quietly after a long silence, I should have defended you. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. Yes, I answered honestly. He lowered his head immediately. I just hate conflict. No, I said gently. You hate disappointing people. That hit closer to the truth. Daniel had spent so much of his adult life trying to keep Jessica happy that he forgot protecting peace and protecting dignity were not always the same thing. Jessica thinks you hate her now, he admitted carefully. I almost smiled at that. Hate is exhausting, I replied. I simply see her clearly. He nodded slowly, but looked troubled. She grew up differently than we did. Her family always cared about appearances. So does everyone, I said calmly. The difference is whether appearances matter more than character. He fell quiet after that. Then finally he asked the question sitting heavily between us all week. Are you really leaving most of your estate to charities? I looked out the window toward the parking lot below where shoppers pushed carts through slush and winter wind. Yes. Even after everything I sacrificed to help you after Dad died. The moment those words left his mouth, regret appeared instantly across his face. But some sentences reveal truths people do not realize they carry. I looked at my son very carefully then. Daniel, I asked softly, do you truly believe loving your mother was an investment account? His face drained of color. No, that is not what I meant. But it is what came out. Silence filled the apartment. Somewhere down the hall a television played softly through another tenant's door. Daniel rubbed his forehead with trembling fingers. I think Jessica and I got lost somewhere, he admitted quietly. You did not get lost, I said gently. You got comfortable. Tears filled his eyes unexpectedly. Mom, I never wanted you to feel unwanted. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. That is the tragedy of weak silence, Daniel. Good people convince themselves they are harmless while standing beside cruelty. He looked down at our hands for several seconds before speaking again. Can things still be fixed? I thought about that question longer than he expected. Outside, snow continued falling in soft white layers across the city. Some things can, I answered carefully. But relationships do not heal because money appears. They heal when respect returns. Daniel nodded slowly like someone finally hearing the truth without excuses protecting him from it. Then his phone buzzed on the table. Jessica's name lit up the screen immediately. He stared at it, but did not answer right away. And for the first time in years, I watched my son sit in silence long enough to actually think for himself. By early spring, I no longer recognized my own life in the best possible way. The snow had melted from the sidewalks, flowers returned to the city parks, and sunlight poured through the windows of the coastal townhouse I rented 3 hours away from Daniel's neighborhood. Every morning, I walked beside the ocean with a cup of coffee in my hand while gulls drifted above the water and sailboats rocked quietly in the harbor. Peace felt unfamiliar at first. When you spend decades surviving tension, calm can almost feel suspicious. But eventually I realized something important. A woman does not become powerful when people finally appreciate her. She becomes powerful when she stops needing permission to value herself. Daniel and I still spoke every week, though our conversations changed. They became more honest, slower, less performative. One afternoon, he admitted he and Jessica had started counseling. "I think we built too much of our life around appearances," he said quietly over the phone. "We forgot how to actually respect people." I stood on my balcony listening to waves crash softly below while warm ocean wind lifted strands of my silver hair. "That happens more often than people admit," I answered gently. He paused before speaking again. "Jessica wants to apologize to you properly." I looked out toward the horizon for several seconds. "An apology only matters when behavior changes afterward." "I know," he whispered. And for the first time in years, I believed he truly did. Jessica eventually called me herself 2 weeks later. Her voice sounded smaller somehow, less polished, less certain. "Margaret," she said quietly, "I was cruel to you. No excuses this time. No whine. No stress. No misunderstandings. Just truth." I sat quietly in my reading chair beside the window while afternoon sunlight warmed the room around me. "Yes," I said calmly. Silence stretched between us. Then finally she asked the question she had probably been afraid to ask for months. "Can you ever forgive me?" I thought about the dinner table, the laughter, the word loser thrown across the room so casually. I thought about all the little humiliations before that night too. The comments, the disrespect, the way she measured human worth through money and status and appearances. Then I thought about Ethan climbing into my lap without hesitation because children still recognize kindness before the world teaches them to worship image instead. "Forgiveness is possible," I said softly, "but trust is earned slowly." She started crying quietly after that. Not dramatic sobbing, just the sound of someone finally forced to meet the version of themselves they spent years avoiding. Months later, Daniel brought Ethan to visit me by the coast for a weekend. We ate seafood at little waterfront restaurants and flew kites near the beach while cold salt air rolled across the shore. Ethan laughed constantly. Children bloom around peace the same way flowers bloom toward sunlight. On their last evening there, Daniel stood beside me watching the sunset bleed orange and pink across the water. "Dad would have loved this place," he said softly. I smiled. "Your father always wanted me to rest someday." Daniel looked down for a moment before asking quietly, "Were you really smiling that night because you already knew about the money?" I looked out toward the ocean again. Waves rolled steadily against the rocks below us while distant lighthouse beams cut through the darkening sky. "No," I answered honestly. I smiled because that was the moment I realized their opinion of me no longer controlled my worth. He stared at me silently after that. Maybe because it was the first time he fully understood that dignity and wealth are not the same thing. One can disappear overnight. The other only disappears when you surrender it yourself. And as I stood there beside the ocean with peace finally settling into the life I had spent decades building for everyone else, I realized something beautiful. Jessica thought unemployment made me powerless. But what truly made me dangerous was finally having nothing left to prove.